and they still are doing a fantastic job of pushing narratives. But it was like, look.
The classic Norm Macdonald bit where he's sitting there and he goes, I was reading a history book and wouldn't you know it, the good guys won every time.
That was me on Unsubscribe last week. I came back to HFH today because the Rome side of this conversation is already up on my other channel, The Roman Pattern. The link's below if you want it. This video is the American side, specifically how the imperial architecture we're all living inside got built, when it got built, and why the 1913 story is the single most important thing that almost no one was taught in school. But first, I owe you a couple of corrections from the episode. Let me fix those on the record, and then I'll give you the argument that I couldn't finish. So 2 corrections I owe you. Both are small, but both are worth fixing because the informed audience is going to catch them. First, I said Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1970. That's wrong. The Nixon shock, when Nixon closed the gold window for the international central banks and effectively ended the Bretton Woods system, was August 15, 1971. 1 year off, but if you're writing the money power timeline, that year matters. The Federal Reserve Act in 1913. Gold confiscation in 1933. The gold window closes in 1977. That's the architecture. Second, one of the guys asked who would have won the 1912 election without Teddy Roosevelt splitting the vote. And I said Rutherford B. Hayes. That's wrong. Rutherford B. Hayes was president from 1877 to 1881. 3 decades before 1912. The Republican candidate in 1912, the one whose vote Teddy split, was William Howard Taft, the incumbent president. Taft finished third between Wilson and Roosevelt. With the Republican vote unified, Taft probably wins. No Wilson. No Federal Reserve Act in the form we got it. No 16th or 17th Amendment in 1913. The whole 1913 package is directly downstream of Teddy splitting the Republican ticket. With those on the record, here's the 1913 argument I didn't finish. 1913 is the single most consequential year in American political history, and almost nobody was taught it properly. 3 things happened in one calendar year. Taken individually, each one looks technical. Taken together, they're the legal founding of the American imperial state. Every monetary crisis, every bank bailout, every expansion of federal power, every temporary emergency that became permanent. All of it traces back to decisions made in 1913 by a small group of bankers and a progressive president who believed he could remake America into something better. He did. It just wasn't better. Let me walk you through the 3. Here's thing 1, the Federal Reserve Act. Signed into law on December 23, 1913, pushed through right before Christmas when half of Congress was already home. But the real story isn't the act itself. It's the Jekyll Island meeting in November 1910, 3 years before. That's when the Fed was actually designed. 6 men went to a private island off the coast of Georgia and spent 10 days drafting the legislation in complete secrecy. Henry Davison from J.P. Morgan, Frank Vanderlip from Rockefeller's National City Bank, Paul Warburg from Kuhn Loeb Company, Benjamin Strong from Bankers Trust, Senator Nelson Aldrich, and A. Piatt Andrew from the Treasury. They used first names only so hotel staff couldn't identify them. They called it a duck hunting trip, and they designed America's central bank as a private cartel of member banks with power to issue currency. The Fed isn't federal. It doesn't have reserves. It's a private banking cartel that the United States government outsourced money creation to in 1913. Here's thing 2. The 16th Amendment, ratified February 3, 1913, 10 months before the Fed Act. It authorizes the federal government to tax income directly. The Supreme Court had struck down a previous income tax in 1895 as unconstitutional. The 16th Amendment was the workaround. Originally sold as only the rich, the top rate was 7% of incomes over $500,000, which is the equivalent of $16 million today. Within 4 years, during the First World War, the top rate was 77%. Same pattern as every tax in history. Narrow start, expand, never retreat. And here's what connects the 16th Amendment to the Fed. If you're going to run a central bank that creates credit for the federal government has to be able to pay the interest. The 16th Amendment gave Washington a permanent revenue stream that wasn't tied to tariffs or state contributions. The Fed creates the debt. The income tax services the debt. They're two halves of the same mechanism, past 10 months apart. Thing 3 is the 17th Amendment, ratified April 8, 1913. This one gets ignored because it sounds technical. It's not. Before 1913, United States senators were selected by state legislatures. After 1913, they're elected by popular vote in each state. It sounds more democratic, but here's why it matters. The original constitutional design made the House represent the people, and the Senate represent the states as political units. That's why every state gets 2 senators, regardless of population, because the Senate wasn't about citizens. It was about states. The 17th Amendment broke that. After 1913, senators represent the same national popular electorate as the House. The states stopped having institutional representation in Washington. Federal power expanded unimpeded for the next 110 years, because the structural check that was supposed to stop it had quietly been removed. Here's me on Unsubscribe laying out the empire thesis. 3 changes in 1 year. Permanent revenue, unlimited money, structural checks removed. That's the 3-legged stool of every empire in history. Rome had it. Britain had it. America assembled it in a single year. And Wilson, he signed all 3.
We've been an empire for quite a while. And when I look at 1913 is kind of a pivotal year for that, because there's 3 key things that happened that year. The Federal Reserve Act passes, the 17th Amendment passes, which means state legislatures no longer vote for senators, and income tax passes that year. And Wilson was probably our worst president.
Yes.
But the progressive era dramatically changes America. And what's happened
Might
since
be
that...
FDR, but go ahead.
Oh. Woodrow Wilson is the devil.
No, FDR is pretty bad, but Wilson kind of started the ball rolling,
For
if that
sure.
makes sense.
Yeah.
And the sad part is some of that is you can blame Teddy Roosevelt for that because he runs third party, but it is what it is. But so in my opinion, I think we are kind of more in an empire stage. And if you look at once again, not a direct foil, but if you look at what was happening in Rome in their 3rd century, because Rome falls in the 5th century, but the 3rd century is kind of what makes everything go wrong. They're at 15,000% inflation by 284 AD. They're no longer controlling their borders. And the politicians are no longer doing things that are good for the future. They're doing things that are good for right now. And when I look at that, I do see a lot of those things happening now. And that is one of the things that concerns me, because we're not at 15,000% inflation, but also how we report the inflationary numbers isn't correct.
So let's talk about Wilson, because this is where Hidden Forces audiences need to get zoomed in. Woodrow Wilson is the inflection point. Every president before Wilson operated in a constitutional framework that took the separation of powers seriously. After Wilson, every president inherits a federal architecture where the executive branch can effectively override the other 2 when it chooses. Wilson didn't just sign the 1913 bills. He reimagined what the presidency was supposed to do. 3 specific things that Wilson did reshaped the country. 1, he created the modern administrative state, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Farm Loan Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, all Wilson era. Every one of them created a permanent federal bureaucracy that reported to the executive branch and operated outside normal constitutional processes. Once you build an administrative state, you can't unbuild it. Every subsequent president inherits a larger one. 2, he militarized public speech. During World War I, Wilson signed the Espionage Acts of 1917 and the Sedition Acts of 1918. These criminalized anti-war speech and allowed the federal government to persecute Americans for criticizing the war. Eugene Debs, the socialist presidential candidate, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech against the draft. The Supreme Court upheld it. The legal framework for the federal suppression of domestic speech starts with Wilson. 3, he ran the first propaganda state. The Committee on Public Information, chaired by George Creel, coordinated propaganda against every medium: newspapers, posters, film, speeches, and church sermons. The CPI produced a technique that Edward Bernays later brought to advertising, and that every subsequent administration would use for domestic political messaging. Modern political communication was invented as a wartime tool under Wilson. Put it together, and Wilson assembled a permanent administrative state, gave it legal authority to suppress dissident, and taught it how to shape public opinion at scale. That's the Imperial Presidency embryo. Every expansion of executive power since, FDR, LBJ, Bush, Obama, Trump, they operate inside the architecture that Wilson built. Here's me on Unsubscribe discussing Wilson specifically. Wilson started it. FDR accelerated it. Nixon tried to rein it in and couldn't. By the time you get to 2001, the Imperial Presidency is the default American governance mode, not an anomaly, not an emergency, just how the country works. And it was a design choice made in 1913.
Wilson kind of started the ball rolling,
For
if
sure.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the sad part is some of that is you can blame Teddy Roosevelt for that because he runs third party, but it is what it is. But so in my opinion, I think we are kind of more in an empire stage. And if you look at once again, not a direct foil, but if you look at what was happening in Rome in their 3rd century, because Rome falls in the 5th century, but the 3rd century is kind of what makes everything go wrong. They're at 15,000% inflation by 284 AD. They're no longer controlling their borders. And the politicians are no longer doing things that are good for the future. They're doing things that are good for right now. And when I look at that, I do see a lot of those things happening now. And that is one of the things that concerns me, because we're not at 15,000% inflation, but also how we report the inflationary numbers isn't correct. We do year-over-year inflation, and there's a lot of things we don't include, like we don't include building materials.
Now the monetary story, because the institutional framework is only half of 1913. The dollar is the other half. 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs Executive Order 6102. It makes private gold ownership illegal for American citizens. Every American is required to turn their gold to the Federal Reserve within a month. The confiscation price is $20.67 an ounce. The penalty for noncompliance is up to 10 years in federal prison. 1 year later, the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The government that just confiscated gold at $20 an ounce revalues it at $30 an ounce. That's a 69% overnight gain on federal gold the government just seized from its own citizens. It's one of the largest property transfers in American history, and almost no one calls it out by name. The purpose wasn't just revenue. The purpose was to break the link between the dollar and gold for domestic monetary policy. With the citizens out of the gold market, the federal government could inflate the currency without political consequence. Every monetary expansion since, the New Deal, the post-war build-out, the Great Society, the Vietnam financing, was possible because FDR had severed Americans from the underlying metal. 1971, Nixon shock. August 15th, Nixon closes the gold window for international central banks. This is the real death of the gold standard. Before August 15th, 1971, a foreign central bank could present dollars to the United States and demand gold in exchange. After August 15th, 1971, they couldn't. The dollar became pure fiat, backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the United States. Since 1971, the dollar has lost about 97% of its purchasing power. Gold has gone from $35 an ounce to over $5,000. Silver crossed 100. Every major asset bubble of the last 50 years. The dot-com boom, the 2008 housing bubble, the 2020 everything bubble was powered by dollar debasement. 80% of the M2 money supply has been printed since 2020 alone. That's not a statistic. That's a statement about what currency even is at this point. Here's me on Unsubscribe describing the inflation mechanism. Now to compare to Rome. By 260 AD, Roman coinage was 5% pure silver. Everyone could see it happening. They felt it in their hands. The modern version is invisible because it's digital. There's no coin to rub, but the mechanism is identical, and it's running faster. Rome took 300 years to debase its currency. We've done most of the work in the last 50.
So the dollar in your pocket is worth less.
Mm-hmm. Quantitative
Quantitative easing.
And explain it.
Money printer
cool.
over.
There you go. But quantitative easing is just the idea that we print more money. So every time that we need to pay for something, we don't have the money, we just print more money. Like even when we did a lot of that stuff during the pandemic where they were giving people money, it's because they were just making money out of thin air. And it's because our money isn't backed by anything. And you can thank Richard Nixon for doing that in 1970 and taking us off the gold standard. But I think that's a lot more insidious because most people don't understand it. They just think, oh, things are getting more expensive. And in reality, sure, costs do raise, but they don't raise in the way that you feel it. They raise because your dollar now buys less, so somebody else needs more dollars to buy something. In Rome, it wasn't quite as insidious because they had, this is a silver coin here. This is Valerian. He's the Roman emperor that's captured by the Persians and used as a footstool. He's the first Roman emperor to be captured.
Footstool, next question.
Well, there's two theories about that too. There's one that he was captured and used as a footstool, one that he was a footstool for a while, then they flayed him and hung him on the wall. But Jesus. The thing that's more insidious about that, that's less insidious about how the Romans did it, is their silver coin in the first century was 95% pure.
Pure silver?
Pure silver.
Here's the part the Hidden Forces audience specifically needs, because this is where the 1913 architecture delivers its consequences in 2026. You have a permanent administrative state, unlimited money creation, and executive power unconstrained by structural checks. The government stops functioning as a government and starts functioning as a distributive mechanism. Power moves not through laws, but through which agencies get funded, which judges get appointed, which contracts get signed, and which crises are declared. On Unsubscribe, we got into some specific examples. Let me put them in the pattern. The California hospice fraud. Medicare was paying hospice providers for patients who weren't there, who had 80% survival rates, because the provider was keeping them alive to keep billing. The state of California and federal Medicare paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent claims, because the oversight architecture is a permanent bureaucracy that answers to itself, not taxpayers. That's the 1913 administrative state metastasized. The Weingart Tower. Los Angeles built a homeless shelter high-rise at $600,000 per studio apartment. Windows already smashed. Equipment dangling out the side. The money got spent. The contracts got signed. The contractors got paid. Did it house homeless people? Well, not really. Was anyone held accountable? No, because administrative state spending doesn't require outcomes. It requires appropriations, and appropriations don't expire. They get spent whether the work was done or not. Judicial immunity. A judge can dramatically alter the course of a person's life based on mood, prejudice, or political alignment with no meaningful accountability mechanism. That's downstream of a constitutional framework where the three branches were there supposed to check each other. When the legislature stops representing the states, that's the 17th Amendment. And the executive builds a permanent administrative state that operates outside normal political process. Well, that's Wilson. The judiciary is the only remaining check. And when the judiciary has absolute immunity, the check doesn't work. And then there's Daniel Penny, the Marine who subdued a violent homeless man on the New York City subway and was prosecuted for murder. That's anarcho-tyranny, the system where the state can't enforce basic order in public spaces and simultaneously prosecute citizens who do. Anarcho-tyranny is the end state of a government that has outgrown its actual governing function. Rome got there in the 3rd century. America is getting there now. Here's me on Unsubscribe on the judicial angle. None of this is individual corruption. It's systematic architecture. When you build the system that Wilson built, run the monetary policy FDR and Nixon ran, and compound the institutional inertia for 110 years, this is what the country becomes. The government stops being a government and becomes a permanent apparatus that serves itself.
I hate the gamification of the legal system.
Dude,
it's my least favorite thing. Like, I don't think plea bargains should be a thing. I hate them. Like, if you're going to try to convict me of what you can prove I did, And when they do this shit where they're like, we're going to try to convict you for something way higher that we can't prove, but we're going to use that with a life sentence to scare you into just taking the plea bargain. So I get to put you behind bars for 5 years, and then it counts as a win on my record.
It's got to drag on for forever because we don't have a right to a speedy and fair trial. That's why.
I didn't even realize the rule against judges can't be touched. They can fuck up as much. They can release a murderer. That dude can go right back out, kill somebody else. Judges cannot be held accountable. That is like,
but they got Al Capone on tax evasion. Like, it's not like they haven't been doing this for a long time. You know what I mean?
Well, I was just talking to somebody about this. I can't remember who. About there was some judge in I can't remember. Somewhere in northern Texas. And a bunch of stuff came out about him, and he's just like nothing necessarily illegal, but he's just like a moody douchebag. So there was a whole bunch of clips. I wish I could remember who I was talking to about this, but a whole bunch of clips. Essentially, it's like if he's in a bad mood that day, like instead of going to jail for 6 months or whatever, community service, it's like you're going to prison for 20 years, like the full extent of the charges.
It's like a self-licking ice cream cone. So here's the synthesis. The reason I run the Roman pattern alongside hidden forces in history is because Rome is the clearest historical demonstration of what happens to a republic that builds the architecture America built in 1913. Rome in the 3rd century, 15,000% inflation from currency debasement. Borders no longer controlled. Politicians focused on short-term survival instead of institutional continuity. Emperors made and unmade by their own bodyguards. A permanent administrative state that outlasted every emperor. A legal system that existed to serve the state, not protect the citizens. As for America in 2026, we're over 3,000% cumulative inflation since 1790, accelerating since 2020. Borders demonstrably uncontrolled. Politicians focused on 2-year election cycles and their post office income. A federal security apparatus that outlasts every administration and shapes which policies survive. A permanent administrative state appropriating trillions with no accountability. A legal system where outcomes depend on judicial mood and political alignment. I'm not saying America is Rome. America has different institutions, different cultural foundations, different economic base. The question isn't whether we're identical. The question is whether the structural pattern Rome ran is running America. And the answer is documentably yes. And this has been for 110 years. The decision point isn't whether to stop it. It's probably no longer possible without collapse. The decision point is what kind of America emerges on the other side of what's coming. The kind that reorganizes successfully, like Diocletian's Rome, or the kind that slides into Western imperial fade, like 5th century Rome. And that decision is going to get made within most of our lifetimes. Here's me on Unsubscribe closing that argument.
If you destroy your money like this, especially with all this wasteful spending that nobody's doing anything about, they're just allowing them to do it, you're in big trouble. You really are.
You're right. We should let everybody vote on it.
What? If you came here from Unsubscribe, thanks for following me over here. This channel, Hidden Forces in History, is where I do the full architecture argument every week. Season 1 right now is Money and Power, Jekyll Island, the Rothschilds, the Venetian Blueprint, how the Federal Reserve actually works. The playlist is linked below. Start with the primer. If you want the Rome side of the same conversation, the direct continuation of what we covered in the Roman Empire chapters on Unsubscribe, well, that's over on my other channel, The Roman Pattern. The companion video to this one, the same Unsubscribe appearance, but the pure Rome argument, is linked below. The next video drops on Wednesday. Subscribe if you want to watch the architecture argument develop in real time. You weren't taught this, and that's the point. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. See you Wednesday.